Two mighty armies and two undefeated generals squared off for one of the most critical battles of history in the fall of 202 BC. World hegemony for the Romans was at stake, and survival as a sovereign force for the Carthaginians who were once dominant. Rarely have two such great captains battled against each other in the annals of warfare as the two who clashed at Zama. Hannibal Barca had inflicted three of the Roman Republic's most severe defeats since the Second Punic War began in 219 BC on the Trebia River. In December 218, on Lake Trasimene in April 217, and on Cannae in August 2, 216. Amazingly, after his sudden crossing of the Alps in October 218, Hannibal kept a polyglot mercenary army together in Italy for nearly 16 years, during which time he had defeated one Roman commander after another. Romans had come to despise him, but his military genius was revered by a handful of experts. The Roman who had met him at Zama was among them. Publius Cornelius Scipio Minor had waged his initial campaigns at the Trebia and Cannae as a junior officer and tribune. Scipio was elected commander in Spain in 210 BC, where his father and uncle had been defeated and slain the previous year. Scipio retrained his army and developed new, more versatile tactics, based on lessons gained from learning how Hannibal conducted his battles and campaigns. His efforts were rewarded with decisive victories in the 208 Baecula battles against Hannibal's powerful younger brother, Hasdrubal Barca, and in 207 Ilipa, who expelled the Carthaginians from Spain by 206. Even then, Scipio had intended to attack the Carthaginian Empire on his home ground in North Africa and had begun trying to charm the various Numidian princes to support his endeavors. Yet jealous political rivals stood in his way. Quintus Fabius Maximus, through his support for delaying tactics, had cemented his status as Rome's elder statesman. Fabius saw his accomplishments threatened by Scipio's strategy after more than a decade of avoiding the direct battle with Hannibal while denying him ample strategic headway to force Rome to surrender. Fabius reminded all those who would listen to the fate of Marcus Atilius Regulus, the Roman consul whose African invasion ended in a tragedy in 255 BC during the First Punic War. Despite this opposition, Scipio spoke of the immense popularity created by his victories in Spain in 205 when he was elected consul. As a consul, he will be one of the two supreme magistrates and officers of the military of Rome. Nevertheless, Fabius saw to it that the army of Scipio would be created from legions 5 and 6, which at Cannae had disgraced itself. Such troops had been sent to Sicily for the duration of the war and forbidden to return to Italy. Scipio's appeal for volunteers to reinforce his army brought in 7,000 veterans, and he found that many from legions 5 and 6 were seasoned soldiers, willing to eradicate the embarrassment of their defeat at Cannae. However, after more than a decade of garrison service in Sicily, they were old men with no experience in set-piece wars. Scipio joined his volunteers with those forces, increasing the strength of each legion to 6,200 foot soldiers, complemented by an equal number of Italian allies. His cavalry included about 300 Roman soldiers per legion and about 900 Italian horses. Scipio spent the whole year preparing his army into his consulship. He also remained in touch with the Numidian lords, whose support for cavalry he found crucial to the success of his enterprise. Scipio put his greatest hopes on his alliance with Syphax, or Western Numidians, king of the Massiciles. Scipio had also pursued the alliance of the young Massinissa, son of King Gaia of the Massiles, or of the Eastern Numidians, hedging his bets. In 204 Scipio was prepared to embark on his great invasion, with his command extended after being elected proconsul. 40 galleys of war were underway to support his fleet of over 400 transports. Around 25,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry were on board. The nearly flawless arrangements were marred only by a letter from King Syphax. Syphax had fallen madly in love with General Hasdrubal Gisco's daughter Sophonisba, a Carthaginian noblewoman. Sophonisba, exercising her charms, persuaded the barbarian lord to forsake Scipio and the Romans and return his allegiance to Carthage, her home city. Nonplussed, Scipio kept out his preparations for invasion. Hannibal brooded in Bruttium as Scipio left for Africa. In 216, when he destroyed 8 legions at Cannae, victory had once seemed within his reach. Much of southern Italy rallied to the Carthaginian cause, and Carthage had promised to send him Spanish and African reinforcements. Roman consuls were unable to beat Hannibal, but won victories over lesser Carthaginian generals. The following year's defeats in Spain and Sardinia destroyed the momentum Hannibal had built for victory. In Italy the Romans persisted, blocking and bullying, in their Fabian tactics and eventually wore down the army of Hannibal. Reinforcements eventually arrived in 207, when brother Hannibal Hasdrubal Barca crossed the Alps. but the invasion ended up in the Meteors River tragedy, where Hasdrubal was slain and his army defeated. So in Bruttium, Hannibal retained his dwindling army. Roman consuls attempting to remove the wily Carthaginian from his base were repeatedly defeated, but Hannibal lacked the means to revive the offensive. There remained one slight possibility, as Hannibal's youngest brother, Mago, invaded Liguria in 205 after being expelled by Scipio from Spain. Mago spent the next 2 years training and drilling Ligurian and Celtic warriors, with an expeditionary force of 18,000 feet, 2,800 horses, and 7 elephants, preparing to conquer Italy as his brothers had before him. In the summer of 204 Scipio crossed over to Africa without incident and landed near Cape Bon. At that time, the Punic navy was not a major threat and his main fear was the lack of funding from Syphax. Scipio was inspired when Massinissa met him in Africa, with 200 crack horsemen, but that was the full extent of what preceded Massinissa. King Gaia had died, and Massinissa had engaged in a hard-fought succession war. At the critical moment Syphax had invaded, linking the Mass Isles kingdom to his own and driving Massinissa out as a mere renegade. Scipio nevertheless saw great potential in the relationship with Massinissa. Soon Massinissa was proving his worth. Carthage had sent out General Hanno on hearing of the Roman invasion, with a large body of heavy cavalry and local tribal auxiliaries, totaling 4,000 horsemen. Massinissa made contact with the power of Hanno and then he fled. He was pursued by the Carthaginians and completely taken by surprise when Scipio's 2,500 cavalry attacked their flank. In the first battle, Hanno and over 1,000 of his men were slain, and another 2,000 were killed or captured in the ensuing pursuit. Scipio had its beachhead secured. Next he advanced to besiege Utica harbor, untouched by Carthaginian forces. Utica has proven to be a harder nut to crack than Scipio predicted. The town nevertheless remained fast after a 40-day siege. In the meantime, Hasdrubal Gisco called out the civic levy and mobilized a massive army, reportedly made up of 30,000 feet and 3,000 horse. He also summoned King Syphax, with a reputed host of 50,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry arriving. Realistically, no more than 30,000 infantry and 5,000 or 6,000 cavalry were possibly counted in the two armies combined. Because of his inferiority in cavalry ability, Scipio decided he would not be able to face this force in open combat, but he had foreseen such a possibility. He only lifted Utica's siege and fell back to Castra Cornelia, a fortified base camp that his troops had built on the tip of a narrow promontory. His army does not want supplies provided Roman naval supremacy. Scipio could afford to wait until a more desirable opportunity emerged during the winter. Hasdrubal and Syphax were satisfied with setting up camps and watching over the Romans. They were overconfident in their numbers and opened talks with Scipio, who played along to gather intelligence on the enemy camps. His negotiators, accompanied by senior centurions dressed as servants, told him they were extremely vulnerable to flame in the Punic camps. Scipio initiated the negotiations in the early spring of 203, but when he decided that his forces were ready, he broke off the peace talks, in the expectation that they would resume soon. Lulled into a false sense of confidence, the in the usual checkerboard formation Scipio's three lines of infantry deployed. As usual, the Hastati, first-line heavy infantry, advanced into the fray, but then the principals, second line, and triarii, reserve veterans, marched out to the flanks to extend the line, instead of following in support. The Punic infantry was enveloped and soon collapsed. Only the Celtiberians fought on. 1,000 miles from home, without the Romans' expectation of mercy, these hardened mercenaries have fought to the last man, allowing Hasdrubal and Syphax to escape with a few of their followers. Under Massinissa and his friend Caius Laelius, Scipio dispatched all his cavalry and light infantry to pursue Syphax and reclaim Massinissa's kingdom. Scipio himself advanced towards Tunis with the heavy Roman infantry, just 15 miles from Carthage. He hoped to overawe the town, which had no army in the field to defend. Calls for surrender were shouted down in the elected oligarchy of ruling aristocrats at Carthage. Carthage was perhaps the world's strongest fortified post, and Scipio's fleet was too small to threaten their communications. It has agreed on 2 defensive measures. First, messengers were dispatched from Italy to remind the armies of Hannibal and Mago. Simultaneously, the Punic home fleet sailed at Castra Cornelia to make a surprise raid on the Roman navy. He was greatly concerned when word was brought to Scipio that the Carthaginian navy had been spotted sailing north. Hastening back to Castra Cornelia, he found his fleet unprepared and quite vulnerable to an engagement. He ordered a row of merchant vessels, covering the bay where his fleet was anchored, to be lashed together. When the Punic fleet arrived, the barrier was assaulted and 60 Roman merchant ships captured and towed off, but the Carthaginians failed to destroy the Roman navy. Meanwhile Laelius and Massinissa pressed for Syphax to be pursued. First Massinissa reclaimed the Massiles kingdom of his father, and then continued the chase into the Massiciles lands of Syphax. Syphax made a stand at Syrta sometime in the fall of 203, in front of his capital. Massinissa started the battle with a formidable cavalry charge but was countered by Syphax's horsemen. However, when Laelius moved up with the Roman infantry, the army was routed to Syphax. As King Syphax tried desperately to rally his troops, his horse was wounded, thrown and captured. Laelius allowed Massinissa to ride in chains before him to Syrta with Syphax on. With sorrow and terror at the sight of their fallen leader, the Massiciles were so overwhelmed that the town fell without a fight. However, the Roman triumph was almost ruined by the wiles of the lovely Sophonisba, who threw herself at Massinissa's feet, begging to be saved from the Romans' wrath. Massinissa was overwhelmed with love for the young woman, and vowed to defend her impulsively. Massinissa arranged a marriage ceremony for her the next day, anticipating that Scipio would not be demanding his new bride's surrender. He wasn't pleased when Scipio learned of these happenings. This woman had sundered his former alliance with Syphax and now she has captured Massinissa's heart. Scipio rebuked the young prince and sternly told him that his Carthaginian bride was theoretically a prisoner of war even though she was not the daughter of Hasdrubal. Massinissa saw only one way of upholding her promise that she would never let Sophonisba fall into the hands of the Romans. He sent her a slave with a cup of poison, which she drank without hesitation. In order to take Massinissa's mind off this horrific turn of events, Scipio had him crowned a king and sent him away to complete Numidia's conquest. Syphax's defeat ended up driving Carthage to sue for peace. Scipio imposed terms that included the removal from Italy and Liguria of Carthage's forces, the permanent cession of Spain and all of the islands, the surrender of the Punic fleet, and a significant tribute. The terms were agreed by the Carthaginian council, and Scipio approved an armistice in Africa, when the treaty was placed before the Rome Senate. While Hannibal managed to hold his own in Bruttium throughout the summer of 203, his brother Mago eventually launched an invasion of Italy. With as many as 15,000 Ligurian and Celtic warriors, Mago had bolstered his 20,800-man expeditionary force, and the Carthaginian army advanced into the Po River Valley. 2 Roman armies had been mobilized to meet them, with 4 full legions and allies, totaling 36,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry. Mago defeated the Roman cavalry with his war elephants, but his Ligurian and Celtic levies did not hold against the legions. The armies battled to a bloody stalemate. Mago was then wounded, and the Carthaginian army retreated grudgingly from the battle. Both sides suffered tremendously. Close to 5,000 Carthaginians were slain and 2,300 were killed in Rome. Departing from Liguria, Mago entered the Gulf of Genoa and found Carthage envoys waiting with orders to embark his army immediately and return to Africa. Another delegate forwarded the same message to Hannibal. Signing as many Ligurian and Celtic mercenaries as he could, Mago set sail as he had requested. Hannibal also submitted to the inevitable, and embarked on his army. Curiously, the Roman navy has not interfered with any army's movement. Mago died of his wound en route to Africa. At Zama he'd been sorely missed. By then the terms of peace dictated by Scipio had been ratified by Rome. The Senate has sent envoys to Africa to see that the agreement is implemented. However, a Roman convoy of supplies was dispersed by a storm, and several of the merchant ships ran aground within Carthage's range. An angry mob persuaded the council to have the Punic navy sent to capture helpless ships. That breached the armistice and nullified the treaty, but since Hannibal had returned, the Carthaginians were sure. In the spring of 202 Hannibal arrived near Hadramedum, approximately 50 miles south of Carthage. He decided to escape the Carthage political infighting and mob scenes, so he kept his distance. He did not have to control one army but three. Few of the troops that had crossed the Alps with him 16 years earlier remained, but among the best in the world were the 14,000 soldiers he commanded, mainly Bruttian, with Carthaginian officers and Libyan and Iberian subalterns. The second army was the force of Mago, some 12,000 seasoned mercenaries from Liguria, Celtic and Balearic times. The third army consisted of raw recruits. A civic levy draft had generated about 14,000 feet, and just over 1,000 horses. Months of learning were hardly enough to turn them into soldiers who could challenge Scipio's legionaries, but they would fight for their homes and families. Hannibal sent hunters to capture elephants and sent messengers to his army in the West Desert to rally the kinsmen of Syphax with their Numidian horsemen. Scipio wanted to answer the landing of Hannibal but could not. Massinissa was far away to the west, and without his horsemen, Scipio dared not approach Hannibal. Messenger after messenger was sent away urging the immediate return of Massinissa with the largest body possible of horsemen. Both Scipio and Hannibal have spent an anxious summer anticipating their Numidian support coming in. But it was Tychaeus, a Syphax relative, who responded first, with 2,000 light cavalry arriving at Hannibal's camp in early fall. Reputedly the finest horseman in all of Numidia. In the meantime, Scipio's word came that Massinissa was on his way too. Now Scipio took his army out on a pillaging expedition, raiding and plundering the Bagratus river-rich valley. Seeing their estates laid waste, the Council of Carthage ordered Hannibal to pursue. The general replied he was going to move in his own good time, but he eventually marched his army out of the camp to intercept Scipio. The estates didn't mean anything to Hannibal, but Scipio marched to meet Massinissa, and Hannibal hoped first to catch the Roman. Hannibal caught up and encamped with Scipio near Zama. Soon afterwards, some of Hannibal's scouts were captured by the Romans. Scipio just gave them a tour and released them from his camp near Naragara. They brought back information which Hannibal was afraid to hear. Massinissa had just arrived with 6,000 cavalry and an infantry. Hannibal, now inferior in his mounted arm, would have to fight here, and he moved west about 4 miles from the Romans to set up a new camp. The legend has it that Hannibal and Scipio had a conference prior to their final battle. Of course, nothing was resolved and most likely these two great captains just wanted to meet face to face. They chatted, then went back to their camps to prepare their armies for battle. Hannibal had as many as 40,000 cavalry but only 3,000. He also had 80 war elephants, the greatest force of its kind raised during the Second Punic War. Scipio had 6,500 horses but just over 30,000 feet. Both generals deployed 3 infantry lines, with a cavalry on the flanks. Hannibal put his 80 elephants ahead of his army in a skirmish line. If only partially trained, it was an imposing force. His first line was composed of 12,000 mercenaries from Mago. The second line constituted the 14,000 Carthage and surrounding country recruits. Hannibal has retained his 14,000-strong old guard in the third echelon. He posted his 1,000 civic cavalry to the right, while Tychaeus and his 2,000 Numidian horse protected the Carthaginian left wing. Scipio organized his legion's 25,000 heavy infantry in the regular 3 lines of hastati, valles, and triarii. However, instead of the normal checkerboard formation, he put the concepts manipulations and triarii directly behind the hastati. Through using this formation, Scipio hoped to neutralize the shock of charging elephants from Hannibal through allowing them to pass through these lanes within his army. Scipio also positioned his flights, or skirmishers, to cover those lanes with missile fire and harass the great beasts. The general put his 2,500 Roman and Italian cavalry on his left under Laelius, while Massinissa kept his 10,000 men to the right. When Hannibal ordered his elephant corps to attack, the Battle of Zama began. Scipio replied by making all his trumpeters shock the elephants, some of whom charged off, also charging on the left wing into their own cavalry, with a major blow. Massinissa took the opportunity to assault the disorganized force of Tychaeus, rapidly driving it out of the area. The Carthaginian heavy cavalry also was charged and routed by Lelius. The Roman horse in hot pursuit galloped from the field. Some historians claim that Hannibal's rapid withdrawal from his cavalry was a preconceived strategy for driving the superior Roman cavalry away from the battle. Not all the elephants were unnerved by the trumpet blast, and Scipio's armies were now lumbered by those still under control. While most of the pachyderm he reorganized his force, instead. To extend the Roman line, the principals and triarii marched out to the flanks. The army of Scipio was longer now, but it was thinner than the force of Hannibal. The Carthaginians inexorably advanced and crashed into the fatigued men of Scipio. An intense fight ensued, and the veterans of Carthaginian began driving into the Roman center. Scipio feared the battle might well be lost if his cavalry did not return within a few minutes. Using the same logic, Hannibal encouraged his men to proceed into the assault when victory may have been within their reach. A cloud of dust had been spied on the horizon at that crucial juncture. Lelius and Massinissa had come back, and their cavalry hurtled to the Carthaginian army's rear at full speed. At the last possible moment Scipio had snapped a victory. Hannibal's army was defeated, and killed his men. 20,000 Carthaginians were reportedly slain, and almost as many were captured. Roman casualties killed 1,500, and several thousands more were likely injured. Hannibal and only a few horsemen survived. Scipio, who had studied Hannibal with awed reverence, had accomplished an envelope remarkably close to that accomplished 14 years earlier by the Carthaginian general Atcani. In a great war, two of the greatest generals of all time had met at Zama. Both went unbeaten into the battle, only one emerged like this. For his great victory, Scipio received the honorary title of Africanus. The Roman general demanded a peace treaty that was only marginally more strict than the one he had previously proposed. On Hannibal's advice, the Carthage council accepted the terms, and finally ended the Second Punic War. These two great generals were both doomed to die in exile. Hannibal worked as an effective administrator of Carthage for a decade until the Romans forced him to leave. The wily general traveled as a mercenary military advisor through the eastern Mediterranean until the king of Bithynia sold him out to the Romans and took poison to escape capture in 183 BC. Scipio Africanus was elected into a second consulship in 194 at Rome. In 190 the consulship was won by his brother Lucius, and Scipio Africanus accompanied the army into Asia against King Antiochus III, who was advised by Hannibal. In 189 Lucius gained a major victory in Magnesia. But soon afterwards rival politicians launched a smear campaign in the Senate and the courts, which ultimately forced Scipio into self-imposed exile. Within a year of his great rival Hannibal's death, Scipio Africanus died.